Welcome to a classic strategic showdown. The legendary Tigran Petrosian with the white pieces takes on Alexander Chistiakov in the time-tested battleground of the Ruy Lopez opening. Let's dive in. Petrosian starts with pawn to e4, and we get the classic Ruy Lopez. Both sides develop their knights, and black's pawn on a6 asks the question of the Spanish bishop, which drops back to a4. White quickly castles kingside, and black develops the bishop to e7. Petrosian's rook moves to e1, preparing for central action, while black kicks the bishop with pawn to b5. And Petrosian plays the perfect response, dropping the bishop back to b3. This is the only move that keeps white's opening edge, maintaining pressure on black's structure. The position now settles into a classic closed Ruy Lopez. Both sides play pawn to d6 and d3, fortifying their centers. Black's knight reroutes to a5, forcing the white bishop to c2, and then clamps down with pawn to c5. And here, Petrosian makes a slight inaccuracy, giving up his opening advantage. There was a much more precise way to continue. The best try was pawn to h3, preparing to fight for the center. After queen to c7, white can strike with pawn to d4. Black takes the pawn on d4, and after the recapture, white is clearly better. But in the actual game, Petrosian plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight but allowing black a chance to equalize immediately, but Chistiakov immediately returns the favor. He misses the golden opportunity to punish white's last move and seize the initiative. The correct response was pawn to h6, immediately challenging the bishop. After white takes the knight on f6 and black recaptures with the bishop, white develops with knight to d2, and with bishop to e6, black would be in the driver's seat. Instead of that, though, black pushes the pawn to b4 on the queen side, and the advantage swings right back to Petrosian. A series of exchanges now erupts. White takes the pawn on b4, and black recaptures. Pieces are developed, and after a brief dance with black's bishop, Petrosian decides to resolve the central tension by trading his bishop for the knight on f6. Petrosian now starts his classic squeeze, pushing the pawn to g4 to kick the bishop. His knight reroutes from d2 back to f1, preparing to join the action, while his light-squared bishop finds a new home on a4. Wow, what a move from Chistiakov. Rook to c8 is a brilliant pawn sacrifice. The idea is to activate his pieces and challenge white's control of the c-file, creating serious counterplay and keeping the position in the balance. A fantastic find. Petrosian calmly accepts the challenge, and his knight on e3 snaps up the bishop on g5, and black must be precise here. The queen takes the knight on g5, and that is the only move that keeps the position level. Any other recapture would have been disastrous, but Petrosian unleashes a brilliancy of his own. Queen to d2. This is a masterful decision, offering a queen trade to neutralize black's attacking potential and steer the game into an endgame where white's positional strengths will shine. Chistiakov has no choice but to accept, and the queen takes the queen on d2, simplifying the position, and Petrosian's knight takes the queen on d2. This is the perfect recapture, the only move that maintains white's small but nagging advantage heading into this complex endgame. The endgame begins. Petrosian plays pawn to a3, prying open the a-file for his rook. After the pawns are exchanged, the white rook infiltrates, and a few moves later, it simply snaps up the weak pawn on a6. First blood to Petrosian in the endgame. Black tries to create counterplay with the pawn push to d5, but Petrosian is in complete control. After a dance with the knights, white captures the pawn on d5 and then rams his own pawn forward to d6, creating a monster-passed pawn that will be a thorn in black's side. The fight now centers around the passed d-pawn. Black's rook is forced to capture it on d6, but this allows white's pieces to find even better squares. Petrosian's bishop comes to b3, and his knight lands powerfully on c4, tightening the screws on black's position. Black's rook shifts to c6 for defensive duties, while Petrosian calmly brings his other rook over to a1, preparing for the final, decisive phase of the game. And right here, Chistiakov makes the decisive mistake. This move turns a difficult position into a completely lost one. There was a much tougher defense. The best try was rook to c7. After the rooks are traded on c7, and the knight recaptures, white's rook comes to a7, but with rook to b8, black is still fighting. But back in the game, black plays the knight to f4, and this allows Petrosian to launch a winning attack. And Petrosian is ruthless. The rook swings over to a7, creating overwhelming threats. Black's knight gives a desperate check on h3, but the king simply steps to h2, completely safe. This is the final nail in the coffin. Black's knight retreat seals his fate, as it fails to create any real problems for white. He had one last trick up his sleeve. Taking the pawn on f2 with the knight was the only chance. After rook takes pawn on g7 with check and king to f, white's bishop comes to a4, but with rook to c5, black is at least still creating some chaos. But in the game, the knight jumps back to g5, and now white's winning plan is unstoppable. Petrosian's bishop slices across the board to a4, cutting off the defense. With the black pieces paralyzed, the white b-pawn begins its relentless march up the board, and the knight lands on b6. This is the final, precise touch. The net is closing, and black has no way to untangle from this suffocating bind. A masterful move. Forced into a corner, black's rook retreats to d8, but it's no use. Petrosian's knight takes the rook on c8, and after the recapture, white is completely dominant. And now the rooks finish the job. The first rook takes the pawn on g7 with check, forcing the king to h8. Then the second rook lands on the 7th rank at c7, establishing absolute control. Black is completely helpless. With no moves left, Chistiakov resigned. A brilliant display of endgame technique from Tigran Petrosian, who expertly capitalized on his opponent's errors to secure the victory. White wins,